So the next film that we watched was Meeting Gorbachev, a documentary about Mikhail Gorbachev himself, co-directed by the infamous Werner Herzog and his co-director André Singer. I actually saw André Singer at the International Documentary Festival Amsterdam show a few clips and do like a master class on this. So I'd seen a couple clips of this film about a year ago. The filmmakers meet with Gorbachev, I think, obviously in the later part of his life, and I think they do 3 interviews or so. There's, and it really is a dialogue between Herzog and Gorbachev, and then goes back through, Gorbachev's life, his decisions, and, at the end of his life, as it sort of suggested, because Gorbachev does mention he thinks he has maybe a couple years, or he wants a couple years, where he sees the decisions that he made, what he's proud of and what he's not. I personally I loved the film, and I really got to know a person that you like when you grow up in the 80s and 90s, of this character, some bit of a hero, sometimes not, and I think that it really was a very touching film, and but it also wasn't Herzog asked those tough questions as well, so it was interrogating and also touching and quite moving at the end as well. So I think a couple of us had tears in our eyes.
Yeah, I must admit I wasn't really going into this film necessarily expecting to be moved, to be honest. And Mikhail Gorbachev, he's a figure I'm aware of, but I'm of the sort of age where I was alive when all this stuff was happening with him coming to power in the Soviet Union and perestroika and glasnost and all this stuff, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But I'm too young to really remember any of it, so I've kind of got vague context. But I've never really engaged with Gorbachev as a figure beyond what you kind of see pop up in retrospective news articles and things like that. So on the face of it, Werner Herzog sitting down to talk to an 88-year-old Russian that you don't really know a lot about, on the face of it could be quite a hard sell, to be honest. But it's an extremely well done documentary, and the reason for that, I think, is because of the approach that Herzog, and presumably his co-director André Singer as well, who remains behind the camera and Herzog is in front doing the interviewing, is the approach they take to their questioning. It's not really about dryly what happened. Mm-hmm. It's more rooted in what did Gorbachev feel about it? What is he proud of? What does he feel his legacy is? What does he think is missing from his legacy? And I think it presents a very rounded picture of who is a very interesting character, right? Because obviously that period in European world history is kind of fascinating, and he's a figure at the centre of it. But I think the decision to focus the questioning on what his internal thoughts were about it really makes a huge difference. And that's not to say that there isn't factual, more, I don't want to say bland, that's the wrong word, but more kind of like straight factual information around it. It gives context, but where the heart of the film is in those conversations that Herzog has with Gorbachev.
Yeah, and it obviously reminded me in the same vein of films that Errol Morris has done, specifically The Fog of War. But there was kind of unlike in The Fog of War, which I think there's a bit of a uncertainty at the end of inconsistency, and in the interview there wasn't necessarily inconsistency, but Gorbachev does kind of reveal things that you might not have thought he would have felt, like the disillusion of the Soviet Union was a mistake, is ultimately what I think it comes down to say.
Yeah, well, that's what's quite by trying to dig into what his feelings are on different things. You get this reasonably complex picture. Obviously, he was very on board with the idea of needing to reform communism, as it was put, and make life better for people who were in the Soviet Union at the time. But that doesn't mean that he believes the Soviet Union was necessarily the wrong way to do that. And I think you get hints of how critical he is of Russian politicians that have followed him.
Absolutely.
And like and they're being a little bit clever about it with the filmmaking as well, because there's not a lot of mention of Putin, right? Like in terms of people talking about him, he's conspicuous by his absence. The person who kind of gets most of the ire from Gorbachev is Boris Yeltsin, right? Who he's a very outspoken critic of anyway. But there is this interesting little shot where, it covers the whole range of Gorbachev's life and career, and there's a segment where, his wife has sadly passed away, and the segment that they show of that is Vladimir Putin paying his respects. So even if it's not engaging with certain things directly, it's very aware of them. But I think it's trying to get to a greater truth about the man, right? It's nodding to the kind of the contemporary politics and what's happening now, but it is more wanting to look at how it's got to that point through the eyes of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, and I think the masterclass that I had gone to was a lot about the archive that they had access to, because some of the archival footage is really incredible wherever it comes from. And there's one particular scene that really struck me when he was signing his resignation from the USSR, and the main camera, they were pushing him to make to make it a very public thing, and he wouldn't. But then the fact that in this film you have that side camera, you have that other view that was there, but it is quite great for a documentary filmmaker. It's a lovely moment.
Yeah, I think the key thing is it blends them very well, because you've got the conversations, but also the use of archive footage, I find is really informative. It's interesting, and it's been edited superbly, I think, because one of the traps that I think you can probably fall into, and certainly I've seen in documentaries that have engaged me less, is kind of archive footage as window dressing, right? It's just there for context, but it's not particularly meaningful context. That's something that can happen. That's very much not the case here. And in particular, there's a clip from another film which was focusing on Gorbachev, where he's wandering around his house and basically just kind of like bumbling around the garden, really. But the context in which it's used, it's in the segment where he's talking about losing his wife.
Right.
And it turns it from just like this old guy in a suit bumbling around a garden to like really being quite moving and heartbreaking.
Yeah,
it's
and
like,
the family, coming back to see the family and everything. I was just, that was really, really touching. It isn't the most innovative film, but sometimes I think we're always searching for so much innovation in some formats and stuff, and that doesn't make to me that doesn't make it less of a powerful piece, because I think it does everything it needs to do to tell this particular story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's you've hit the nail on the head there. I think it's not it's not doing anything particularly new, I don't think, but there's a lot to be said for doing it well, and it absolutely does that.
Great. So we highly recommend you see it if you're interested in Soviet history, 80s history, and or a good film.